material. In fact, the material tonight is such that I think we'll only have time to get through chapter 11, and then we'll pick up next time with chapter 12, and then we've got several weeks to deal with Samson, the man who was strong but stupid, and a lot of lessons to learn from Samson. And we didn't quite finish our discussion last time about Gideon. Remember, there's more said about Gideon, 100 verses, than any of the judges. And so there's a lot of lessons about Gideon. And one of the things I want us to discuss, because I think it's really prevalent and relevant, is Gideon starts off really humble, and then God chooses him, and he rises to the occasion, and he does a great job. And he says, I shall not be king over you, but Jehovah should be king over you. But then, as time went on, he has a son that he names Abimelech, who winds up causing all types of trouble, maybe perhaps because he was named, my father is king. He starts acting like a king, and he's, multiplies all these wives, and he has them burn incense to this golden ephod that was a tribute to his victory. So he doesn't end well. And sadly, that is true for so many Bible characters. In fact, it is so true for so many people. So I want to talk about this for a minute. What do you think were the sources of Gideon's downfall? This is what we ended our class with last time. Obviously, you have a victory, and everybody's, you're the hero, and everybody's applauding, and it's really easy for that to go to someone's head. And in this case, they start thinking they don't need God anymore, although it was clear that God gave him the victory. He's depending upon the spoils of war, which were immense. He's certainly living like a king. And he's really not calling for a revival and a commitment to the Lord. Nothing said about that. It's interesting. Nothing said about the tabernacle. Throughout all the book of Judges, very little at all said about the tabernacle, which is where they should have been worshiping and putting their efforts, because that's where God dwelt at the time. And, thank you. Is the problem here? You must update this app to launch it. Update the app to launch it. Oh my, that's not a good thing. No. So some of you IT guys say no. Just say no, right?
I think it's on the TV itself.
Yeah, it must be.
Might be on the left-hand side.
Okay, that seems to have solved the problem. Good. And obviously, this is further enabling the cycle to repeat itself, which means they get their victory, they're initially thankful, then after time, especially the next generation, forgets, and then they become like the nations round about them, and they rebel, bow down to other gods, and then God sends a nation in to teach them a lesson, not bless them, because they're not blessing him. And so that's just, history rhyming over and over and over again. So, who else in the Bible had problems after victory? Can you think of some?
We mentioned David last week.
Yeah. David is the most obvious. He had been out in battle. He'd had all these victories. And because things were going so well, he decided, I'm not needed out here anymore. So he's at home catching some R&R, which means what, Chase?
Rest and something.
Rest and relaxation. Yeah, rest and relaxation. The younger generation doesn't use that term, huh? At any rate, and so that was when he got into trouble, when things were going well. And he let his guard down. Same thing with Elijah. Elijah had this great victory, took down the 400 prophets of Baal. All the people are chanting, Jehovah, he is God, Jehovah, he is God, which in Hebrew is they were chanting Elijah, because that's what Elijah means. Jehovah, he is God. And so he thinks, wow, it's all going to be great, but it doesn't end up great because Jezebel doesn't care. She's got a hardened heart, and so she just sends people out to try to kill him, and he has to run for his life. He's done nothing wrong, had a great, victorious, he was an instrument of God. He gets so depressed, he asks God to take his life. And how does this relate to new converts? In what sense have new converts had a great victory?
Over death, over sin.
Yeah. I mean, they've decided to follow Jesus. They've come to the right decision. They've had a good and honest heart. They've responded, and everything should be going great. They go on their way rejoicing, but a lot of people shortly after they make a decision fall away. And they fall back into sin or the world or change their mind. So it's really interesting how that's just such a vulnerable period for people right after victory. And so there's some theological lessons here. A. Bonner said, we must be as watchful after the victory as before the battle. Especially when it comes to, think about a new convert. They've got their sins forgiven through the blood of Christ, but who is still there now, more determined than ever to go after him? Satan. So they need to be doubly careful. Once you put your hand to the plow, Jesus said, if you look back, you're not worthy to follow me and to be in the kingdom. And yet, so often, Satan wins because he's just lost a child of his, so to speak. And so he's more than determined to try to get that person to be filled with doubts and to miss the world and to want to go back to it. Wars may be over, but the dangers have not vanished. That is so true. 56 nations in the world today have real serious issues with landmines left over from former wars that have now ceased. Angola, there's an estimated 20 million landmines throughout the territory. Afghanistan, 10 million. Cambodia, 4.5 million. And there's just horrific stories all the time about people that are just, going for a walk and they don't realize they're in an area where there had been fighting and they'd laid landmines and people either are killed or have legs or feet that have to be amputated from stepping on a landmine. Apparently, they're very difficult to find and expensive to, deactivate. And so it's a tragedy. So even after the peace treaty is signed, there's always consequences. And there's these landmines that are left. There are pitfalls in victory. And it's so important not to be blindsided by thinking, I've arrived in some way. And people tend to stop looking to God for strength and wisdom and feel like they don't need God anymore, I guess. But it's really ironic, and I just wanted to take a few moments to talk about this because I think this is relevant to our own lives as well. What do you think are some of the pitfalls of victory? Anything you want to mention that I haven't said or mentioned tonight? You ever had an experience in your own life where maybe you let your guard down after a time where things were going really well and maybe you didn't think about the consequences of, this good thing? Just like there's a silver lining in problems, there's oftentimes a dark lining in good things that come. Todd?
Well, I just think of it takes effort. It's not a natural thing. We have to drive those roots of faith down and just keep pushing and keep striving. You think of Paul in Philippians when he said, not that I've already attained it, but I've strived and pushed forward. Then Jesus said to strive to enter by the narrow gate. I mean, the idea is it's a constant, continual effort. And that's why we come here together so we can, have fellowship with one another and hopefully get filled up.
Yeah, absolutely. Strength to go out and take on Satan once again, who's always after us. The only good thing you can say about Satan is he never gives up. And we need to remember that. Abraham Lincoln made this statement that always impressed me. He said, "The real test of a man's character is not adversity, but power." And it reminds me of Proverbs 24:10. And Solomon said, "The man who shrinks or falls or becomes faint in time of adversity, his strength is small." Everybody has to deal with adversity. But the real test of a man's character is how he handles power. And in the case of these judges and these people that God uses for this purpose, now they have a position of influence and fame, and everybody's looking up to them. One of the things historically that George Washington did that was unprecedented in world history, that just amazed everyone. In fact, there's a book called George versus George. It's about King George of England versus George Washington, who led the Continental Army and became the first president of the United States. And when he heard what George Washington did after he defeated the British, he couldn't believe it. And he said, "George Washington is the greatest man and statesman of our day." What did he do that shocked everybody so?
He did what Gideon could have made king.
Yeah, he kind of said the same thing that Gideon said. No, I'm not going to set up some new kingdom. We've broken away from Britain. No, you're not going to make me king. A lot of people wanted to. And he said no. He goes, "I want to go back to the farm with Martha. This isn't about me controlling you. You need to rule yourselves." And so they had the Articles of Confederation, which was so loose it actually was not very workable. And so finally, they had the Constitutional Convention, which came up with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and all of that. And still, George Washington did not want to be the leader. He wanted to go home to Mount Vernon and farm. And he's the only president that ruled because everybody there unanimously said, "You're the man for the job. We want you to do it." And he said, "Okay, I'll do it only because I guess I'm needed, but I'm not going to be here long." And after 4 years, he wanted to step down, and they begged him not to, and he reluctantly said okay. And then finally, after 2 terms, he said, "I'm out of here. You need to turn this over to someone else." So he was hungry for freedom, not for personal power. And I don't know what it is, but there's something about power that most people cannot let go of and just cannot resist. And it's just something about human nature. So we all need to think about these things, especially their spiritual equivalent, and make sure that when God blesses us, we don't lose our humility, and that we always recognize the source of all of our blessings and give him the appropriate praise and glory for it. Okay, any comments about that? Yes?
Yeah, I think that's what I was taking away from this, and what you just said about humility, like that chapter 6, verse 8 says, "To walk humbly with the Lord." And Moses momentarily slipped and forgot the humility that God required of him, and it cost him physical entrance into the physical promised land. So, walking humbly with your Lord, the word walking implies that it's an ongoing thing that you can't forget to lose track of.
That's absolutely right. And the irony about Moses is the Bible says that he was the meekest person that lived during his day. So even the meekest person that lived on the planet during his day lost his cool, lost his temper, and for a moment lost his head about what was really going on. Yes,
Well, in the
Les.
story of Gideon, one of the things that I mean, we could say that Gideon's pride caused him to sin at the end and so forth, but there's a little episode right before that where the two kings tell him, go ahead and kill them, not have his son do it, kind of thing. And I'm wondering if a man gets challenged like that sometime, you can go astray further. You think, well, I guess I can do this, but now he wants more, and that kind of played into the part that goes right after that, where they're collecting the spoils and all that kind of stuff. He was egged on, I think.
Interesting. Yeah, good thoughts. Okay, let's look. Most of this is going to be about Jephthah. That's Jeph with a T. And what kind of period of time are we looking at here? We are really, if you're looking at this on the timeline, we are getting really toward the end of the period of the Judges. Notice this last depression of the Ammonites, about 1110 BC or thereabouts. You see Tola, Jephthah, Eli even, and Jair. And then you got the Ammonites that are subsided, and then the Philistines, which become the major problem that will actually not be completely quieted or defeated until David. So the big oppression prior to the Philistines coming in is the Ammonites. And the text says that the Ammonites on the one side and the Philistia on the other oppress the people during this time. So the Ammonites come from the east and the Philistines come from the west, and they're kind of squeezed. And that was kind of what's going on here. One of the best ways to summarize this section, I call this local reject makes good, is first you've got a nation in decay. Talks about all the different idols that they worshipped. And then because they're so terribly persecuted and they cry out to the Lord, and God says, finally, after they put away their idols, I'll deliver you. They've got an army without a general. And no one's willing to step up. They're all scared to death. So they're a leader in demand, a nation in decay, a leader in demand. Then, because of a very ill-advised rash vow, Jephthah, who's the hero of this story, is a father in despair. And I want to spend a good amount of time talking about rash vows and do you think he actually killed his daughter or not? And then a ruler in defense, which is what happens in chapter 12. There's actually a civil war that goes on once again as the nation during this time period is just fragmented and weak because every man does that which is good only in his own eyes. So let's look at this local reject makes good. This is a nation in decay. What really happens here? If you look at Judges 10, verse 6, and the children of Israel again did that which was evil in the sight of Jehovah and served the Baalim and the Asheroth. Mentions all these different gods we'll talk about in a minute. And the anger, verse 7, of Jehovah was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of the Philistines and to the hand of the children of Ammon. And they vexed and oppressed the children of Israel. 18 years oppressed they the children of Israel that were beyond the Jordan. So think of the Transjordan region. Not Canaan per se initially, but the Transjordan region. Gad, Reuben, and the half-tribe of Manasseh is the area of Gilead that's under consideration here. And it says that Israel was sore distressed. So they are certainly in decay. And they are showing a lack of gratitude because instead of continuing to serve and revere and be thankful to Jehovah for what he has done for them in the past, what are they doing? They continue to give in to the culture around about them and bow down to all these different idols. And in so doing, they are certainly not showing submission to the Lord. And they have a lack of adequate leadership, which makes them turn to this man, Jephthah. Now, why did they lack gratitude? Under Tola and Jair, it had given them 45 years of peace and prosperity. So everything's going well, so why worship other gods instead of your God that is so powerful and so special and has been so good to you? Well, one of the things I think is that Jehovah God wants you to be holy as he is holy. And that's hard. And a lot of the people didn't want to do that. A lot more fun to go and worship all these other pagan gods that, involve fertility cults and all types of sexual immorality. But they're ignoring Moses' command to be thankful and bless the Lord. Deuteronomy 8 and verse 10, Moses says, when you go in the land and God blesses you and you have all these houses you didn't build and all these fields that you didn't plant and all this blessing, he goes, make sure you stop and remember the source of those blessings. Be thankful and bless the Lord. Because Thanksgiving is mighty important. And why is that so important in part? Because it's a defense against pride, selfishness, and idolatry. In Psalm 69 verse 30, David is talking about a time of victory. And he says, I will sing a song. And the idea in the original is a new song. In other words, I'm going to write this song commemorating the victory, and I'm going to praise God and thank him for it. And I'm going to have this song that can be continually sung throughout history so that there's this memorial sort of reminder of who was the source of our victory and who needs praise for it. It's one of the reasons for the song of Moses and the Lamb in Deuteronomy. He penned a song to remind them of what God had done for them when they came out of Egypt. And so being thankful and constantly reminding yourself of the source of your blessings will keep you from thinking you're big stuff or hot stuff. Keep you from selfishness. And you want to be faithful to this God who's been so good to you. So it keeps you from idolatry. Okay, why did they lack submission? Well, I think this kind of is a part of the pattern of the judges. When we are comfortable, we tend to forget God and assume we can sin and get away with it. I mean, that's the bottom line. I think it's really true that if we're faced with temptation and we go ahead and give in to the temptation, at that moment we love the pleasure of that sin more than we love God. That's the problem. And we think somehow or other we know better than God and that we're not going to have to give an account for what we did. Let me ask you a question. What would happen if the consequences of sin occurred immediately? Well, first, we'd all be dead. Well, first of all, I think there'd be very few takers, right? If the problems and pain associated with sin happened right away, or even very soon, and you could connect the negativity with the sin, then fewer people would sin. But if that happened really quickly, then it takes away free moral agency, right? And so the people who live by faith recognize that, I may get some short-term pleasure or benefit out of doing this, or lying, or stealing, or whatever it may be, but that eventually I'm going to have to give an account for this, and eventually these things come home to roost, and the way of the transgressor is hard, and that's not the way I want to live. So just being a person of faith helps us to remember these rules are not just set up to take away our fun. They're not arbitrary. They're there because God loves us and he wants to keep us from harm. Comfortable living often produces weak character. Historians say that great nations are born in Stoicism and die in Epicureanism. Stoicism is hard work and self-denial. Epicureanism is eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may die. And so it's been over 200 years. Where do you think we are as a nation on that continuum? Now, how unfaithful had the nation become? I think it's really interesting. Moses told the people that there's 7 main Canaanite nations. Each one of them is more powerful than you are. But you're going to go in and you're going to take on all 7, and I'm going to give you the victory. And you got 7 specific idols mentioned that they bow down to in this list. And that may be a parallel to the 7 nations that they were supposed to take over and dispossess, but instead these nations have possessed them. So what gods did Israel serve? Well, it says they served the Baal or the Baalim and the Ashtaroth. That's a picture of Baal. There are hundreds of these that have been found throughout Palestine. And it's thought of mainly as the god of Phoenicia or of Sidon. And it's usually pictured as a sword in one hand and a thunderbolt in the other. It's the storm god and the god of war. So when they start to bow down to Baal, a lot of times God causes famine to come across the land. So they're bowing down and worshiping the storm god, and guess what happens? They have no storms. Serves them right. And then they keep on praying to Baal to give them rain. It doesn't work until they finally come to Jehovah. It's often missed in the dialogue because we're not aware that Baal was the storm god. So they're worshiping the Baals and the Ashtaroth, the gods of Syria, the gods of Sidon, which again was another nation that worshiped Baal, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites. And by the way, that's a picture of Chemosh, who's mentioned in the text as the god of the Ammonites. Man, who would want to worship that? And also Molech, that was well known for having the arms hollowed out and you put hot coals in it. You put your firstborn on top of it as you offer it up to Molech and Chemosh, associated with child sacrifice. Now, I think that's significant because Molech and Chemosh, the incestuous descendants of Lot, remember how that started? They had a bad beginning, and they were very wicked people. And Jephthah has one daughter, an only daughter. Great contrast to these other judges that are mentioned that have like 30 sons and 20 daughters or something. All these children, obviously from multiple wives. And Jephthah has this one daughter. And there's a sense in which he's going to wind up sacrificing her. And the gods of the Philistines. Did this seem to win them any favor with the neighboring nations? Not at all, that we can tell. They weren't like, oh, well, you're one of us. May have had something to do with why they intermarried a lot with these folks. But although they seemed to be very ecumenical or polytheistic about their choice of gods, it didn't seem to convince their neighbors to be nice to them. But one thing is certain, they paid any attention to Deuteronomy 27 and 28. Doing that eventually resulted in the curses of the covenant come crashing down upon their head. The consequences of sin don't occur immediately, but eventually you got to pay the piper. I remember, never forget this, 2005, I'm talking to my dermatologist, and he says, you got skin cancer. You're going to have to get this removed. And I've got this spot on my nose where they had to dig down and get rid of some skin cancer. Left a scar. And I said, I'm careful, I don't get sunburn. He goes, oh, this isn't from recent. This is from you when you were a teenager. I go, really? He says, yeah. He said, you were probably burned over and over again, fun in the sun. You were a swimmer. You were out in the sun all the time. I go, yeah, I was a lifeguard for like 3 or 4 summers. That was my summer job. He goes, well, what happens is you mess up your DNA, and in the early stages, every 7 years, we replace all of our cells. That's what the aging process is all about. So it's like a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. In the early days, you don't see any harm. But eventually, because you got it damaged back there when you were a kid, these last copies turned to cancer. I said, so I'm paying now for something I did 40 years ago? He goes, yep. Boy, that's a scary thought. What other mishaps was I involved in 30, 40 years ago I haven't paid for yet, right? It's kind of scary. Somebody said you don't really die of some particular disease. You die your whole life. And so even what you do in your youth, even though we're young, at least physically, it can come back to bite you later. And certainly that is true spiritually. So, when the people cried to God for relief, what was God's response?
Go after God to do it.
Yeah, he says, he told them that even though he had defeated their gods that they were serving, they had decided to serve them, the ones that God previously had defeated. Therefore, he would not let the Israelites turn to those gods. He would let the Israelites turn to those gods for assistance. In other words, okay, you're bowing down and all these other idols and neglecting me. Now you're in trouble. Why don't you let them deliver you? He basically says no. What do you think about that? Okay, high cost to low living. Good thoughts, Chris. Yeah, absolutely. God is not mocked. And he can't be manipulated. And so they're coming, asking him for deliverance from these very peoples who worship these gods that they've been worshiping. And they haven't even put away these gods at this point. They haven't really repented. You ever known people to do what's wrong and then immediately ask for help and, they're not, and they haven't even given up the addiction or they haven't given up the bad behavior that caused the problem to begin with? Well, it doesn't help the person if you just bail them out and bail them out. Parents need to realize this. Sometimes the worst thing you can do is bail out your kids, and the best thing you can do is let the consequences of their actions sting a little bit and hopefully learn so they don't do this again. And so then they come back and they put away these gods, and then they ask again. And this time, God saw their misery and was touched. Because he still loved them, even though they were the worst prodigals imaginable. And so this time he says, okay. What does Romans 1, 24 through 28 say about people who get involved, particularly in certain kinds of immorality, and they think of evil and only evil continually? Talks about, in some cases, that he just basically gave them up, walked away, because they had no intention of repenting, and they just so involved in their sin. And finally, these people, though, apparently had stopped getting to that point. And so he decides to make arrangements that they might be delivered. It was only after they decided to put away the foreign gods that God relented and listened to their pleas. Their hope should be in God's power and character, not in anything else. So, remember the little summary outline here? A nation in decay is the first part. lack of gratitude, lack of submission. And now, again, they're willing to let God lead them, but there's a lack of adequate leadership. One of the things that is overlooked oftentimes in reading this section of text is when God says, okay, I'll answer your prayers, I'll deliver you. The people said in verse 18, what man is he that will begin to fight against the children of Ammon? And nobody came to mind except this fellow Jephthah, who had been chased out of town because he was the child of a harlot. But I want you to notice something about the drifting. How does Judges start? And it came to pass after the death of Joshua that the children of Israel asked of Jehovah, who shall go up to fight with us against the Canaanites? So they started up asking Jehovah who should lead us. And now they're just looking among themselves instead of asking of Jehovah. It's interesting, huh? And so then it talks about this man, Jephthah, a Gileadite, who was a mighty man of valor. So again, they had an army but no general. And this guy is the least likely candidate you could imagine. Often, having poor leadership or a lack of leadership is a judgment against the nation and an evidence of moral decay. I mean, I'm really convinced that we get the leaders we deserve because the leaders we have are generally a reflection of the people themselves, especially in a democracy. And so people aren't outraged at corruption, frankly, because a lot of people around here in the population are corrupt. So they lie and easily steal and cheat in their own lives, and why should they be bothered when their leaders do so, or surprised? What a contrast to Acts 13, 1 through 4, where they're needing someone to go on a missionary journey, and they list all these names, and they're all praying and fasting, and it says the Holy Spirit called out Barnabas and Saul. And then they all prayed and laid their hands upon them. The implication is that any of those people, even though it was a very tough thing and they put their lives at risk, were willing to do what needed to be done. That's what happens when people are committed to the right thing. A nation, however, often gets the leaders they deserve. Isaiah 51:7 says, the righteous perish and no man layeth it up to their heart. The idea is during the time of Isaiah, he's talking about the time of the Assyrian captivity, the northern 10 tribes, they're just wicked to the core. And the few people that are righteous are perishing, and nobody's bothering to stop what they're doing and to try to help other people because they're just selfish. So nobody wants to step up and be the leader. Edmund Burke said, all that is required for evil to triumph is for good men and women to do nothing. It's always been the case. So, a nation in decay, a leader in demand. Now, what do we know about Jephthah? I've already alluded to this. He's a fella that is a Gileadite from the tribe of Manasseh. Apparently, he was fairly muscular, a mighty warrior. But this guy's the son of a prostitute. I won't mention the word that we typically use to call people that come from this background. But I think you know what it is. And his brothers drove him away to Tob. And it says he seemed to attract worthless or vain fellows. So he's not running with the most enviable crowd. And he located his home far away in Mizpah. So you can see that where the Ammonites are, and they're encroaching on the Transjordan region. And he has to leave to go to a small town of Mizpah. There's 3 Mizpahs in the Bible. We're really not sure which one that he was excommunicated to. Yes?
Another thing we know about Jephthah is that he knew the history of Israel.
Oh, very well. Which I think also relates to this question of did he really do it, as far as literally following through with his vow. What observations can you make about the elders of Gilead asking this fella to lead them? The person that before had been an outcast. Yes, Gene?
It reminds me of previous chapter for switching their allegiance back to him.
Yes.
The children of Israel were switching their allegiance over here to Jephthah. Also reminds me of Paul when Paul was in prison, and the leaders wanted to, once they learned of his lineage of being a Roman, all of a sudden changed their mind and wanted to get him out of prison. And he said, "No, I'm not having it."
Yeah, it's kind of a bit ironic that they, before, had driven him out of town and just basically excommunicated him. And now they come running to him, will you lead us? And he kind of chides them for that when they come to him. Oh, now you want me to help you. And secondly, their trust seems to be more in his physical abilities. He's this mighty warrior, rather than his spiritual abilities. And so once again, they're still leaning and thinking in a fleshly way. Yes?
It's just funny how human it is for people to change their allegiance once they think you can help them.
Yeah, they call that strange bedfellows, right? Yeah. So, you know what? I don't know that we have time to talk about it. We've only got a couple of minutes here. Time just flies. What reasons did the Ammonites give for attacking Gilead? Way back in their history, this used to belong to us, and so we're going to take back this territory that 300 years ago belonged to us. So he gives a rather interesting historical response, which we don't have time to cover. And he says, no, we're the wrong party here, and not you, and you need to get your history straight and all of that. And Jehovah would deliver us, and you're wise not to fight this battle. And so in the context of this, as he's going to battle, he says, Jehovah, if you will give me victory, then whatever comes out to meet me when I come back home in victory, I'll offer up to you as a sacrifice. Now, normally, in ancient world, you often kept sheep as pets, not so much dogs, but sheep. And that would have made a great clean animal sacrifice. And I think he thought, even if my favorite sheep comes out to greet me, I'll offer that up to you as a sacrifice. But instead, who comes out to meet him? Yeah, his daughter with timbrels and dancing and all excited. She heard about the victory, and so he rents his clothes and says, oh, what have I done? And that's known as Jephthah's rash vow. And boy, was that ever. You know, he didn't specify whatever animal. He said whatever. You got to choose your words carefully, right? Better be careful about making vows without thinking about the implications and how when you make a vow, God expects you to keep it. And that's true of marriage vows, even when it's hard. And so I often tell couples in counseling, you're madly in love right now, but, you know, this thing could go sour. What are you going to do then? You know, I don't want you to make some rash vow there at the altar. You need to think about what you have said and what you are doing. So we're going to pick up next week with what problems do you see with Jephthah's vow? I gave you a couple of them. And do you think he really did it? Do you think he actually sacrificed her? I had a Bible professor at Florida College who very strongly believed that he did. Because it says, I'll offer it up as a burnt offering, whatever comes to meet me. And then it says he did according to his vow. So it is what it is. And personally, I think there's more to the story than that. And I'm doubtful of that. But it's a big controversy. And I'm not going to be dogmatic one way or the other. But let's talk about that next week. And let's also finish up the chapter 12, where he has to deal with some people that were unhappy about his victory because they weren't called and they didn't get the spoils of war. Surprise, surprise. All right. Thank you all so much. We'll pick up here next time with Jephthah's rash vow, and do you think he really did it? Thank you.
You think you would turn to the next